The Wild West, often romanticized as a land of opportunity, rugged independence, and adventure, also had a dark and violent side, especially when it came to the concept of justice. In a time and place where formal law enforcement was scarce, punishment was often swift, brutal, and carried out by vigilante groups or local authorities who operated without the checks and balances of modern legal systems. The harsh and unforgiving environment shaped a society where maintaining order was of utmost importance, and punishment became a public spectacle aimed at instilling fear. Let's dive into some of the most brutal forms of punishment used in the Old West. Hanging, a symbol of frontier justice. Hanging became one of the most common and severe forms of punishment in the Old West, especially for crimes like murder, horse theft, or even acts that threatened the social order. It was seen as a necessary deterrent, especially in towns where lawlessness was rampant. What made hanging particularly brutal was the lack of precision. Many executions were botched, leading to slow, agonizing deaths, where the condemned would either strangle slowly or, in rare cases, survive if the rope or gallows malfunctioned. This form of justice was often carried out publicly, with entire towns gathering to watch as a grim reminder of the consequences of defying the law. One figure who became notorious for his association with hanging was Judge Isaac Parker, known as the Hanging Judge. Operating in Fort Smith, Arkansas, Parker sentenced over 160 people to hang, embodying the extreme lengths to which frontier justice would go. His courtroom was a symbol of the rigid and unforgiving legal measures in place, a stark reflection of how seriously crime was taken in these lawless regions. Vigilante justice and lynching. Order without the law. The lack of structured law enforcement led to the rise of vigilante groups, citizens who took justice into their own hands. While these groups were often motivated by a genuine desire for safety and order, their actions frequently led to violence and unregulated punishment. Lynching became a particularly brutal and common method of justice, especially when there was frustration with the formal legal system, which was seen as ineffective or slow. Lynching wasn't merely a form of execution. It was an event, a ritual designed to instill fear in entire communities. While some victims were guilty of crimes, many others were targeted because of personal vendettas, racism, or the desire to maintain social hierarchies. African Americans, Native Americans, and other minorities were disproportionately victims of lynch mobs, revealing the deep-seated prejudices of the time. These events were often ignored by local law enforcement, and in some cases, lawmen even participated, demonstrating how deeply systemic racism and vigilante justice were intertwined. Tarring and feathering, public humiliation and pain. Another brutal punishment that was often used as a public spectacle was tarring and feathering. The process involved pouring hot tar over the victim's body and then covering them in feathers. This punishment was not just about physical pain, though the tar caused severe burns and was nearly impossible to remove. It was also about public humiliation. Victims were often paraded through town, with the community jeering and mocking them. Tarring and feathering was commonly employed for political dissenters, thieves, or individuals who broke social norms. The goal wasn't just to punish the individual, but to send a strong message to the community. Step out of line, and this could happen to you. Flogging. Pain as a deterrent. Flogging was another common punishment in the Old West, often used for less severe crimes like theft, defiance, or disorderly conduct. A person convicted of a crime could be tied to a post and whipped across the back with a leather whip. The number of lashes was determined by the local authorities or a judge, and it varied based on the crime and the whims of those in power. Flogging was brutal and left permanent scars, both physical and psychological. In some cases, the damage from flogging was so severe that it led to infections or even death. The public nature of flogging, which often drew crowds, made it a tool not just for punishing the individual, but for sending a message to the entire community. People would witness the brutality and be reminded of the consequences of breaking the law. Branding, a permanent mark of shame. For crimes like theft, especially cattle rustling, branding was used as a form of permanent punishment. Criminals would be branded with a hot iron, just like livestock, marking them as thieves for the rest of their lives. The branding was typically done on visible parts of the body, such as the face, hands, or arms, ensuring that the individual would be forever identified by their crime. This form of punishment was as much about social ostracization as it was about the physical pain of the branding. A branded person would find it nearly impossible to reintegrate into society, and the mark of their crime would follow them wherever they went. Branding exemplified the Old West's harsh stance on property crimes, particularly in a culture where livestock and land were so crucial to survival. Dueling and gunfights, the romanticized frontier justice. While dueling has been romanticized in pop culture as a noble way to settle disputes, it was far less common than Hollywood would have us believe. However, when it did happen, it was often fatal. Dueling was mostly a practice of outlaws or men looking to defend their honor. The high-stakes nature of these gunfights only added to the already dangerous environment of the frontier, where disputes were settled quickly, and violence was a constant threat. In some areas, lawmen had the authority to shoot suspects on sight if they posed a significant threat. This practice bypassed formal trials and further fueled the gunfighting culture. It wasn't uncommon for outlaws and even law-abiding citizens to be caught in the crossfire of such brutal justice. Lynchings and systemic racism. Perhaps the most tragic and brutal example of punishment in the Old West was the lynching of minorities. These extrajudicial killings, often driven by racial prejudice and fear, were not just acts of punishment but tools of terror used to maintain the racial and social order of the time. Black, Native American, and Mexican communities were frequent targets of lynch mobs, who used these violent spectacles to assert dominance and control. The gruesome nature of these lynchings, often involving torture, mutilation, and posthumous displays of the body, reflected the deep racial divisions of the era. Local law enforcement, far from stopping these events, was often complicit, highlighting the systemic racism that allowed such violence to go unchecked. Conclusion: the legacy of brutal punishments in the Old West. The Old West's approach to justice was a product of its environment, an unforgiving landscape where survival was a daily struggle and law enforcement was a luxury. In the absence of formal legal systems, brutal punishments like hanging, flogging, tarring and feathering, branding, and lynching became the norm, serving both as punishment and as a warning to others. These methods of punishment weren't just about maintaining order. They were also about reinforcing social hierarchies, controlling marginalized groups, and creating a culture of fear.